Hello everyone. So this lab is the last lab for the semester, lab 6. And in this lab, you don't have to run any implementation or do any bitstream generation, but you have to use the template code that is already given to you. Just like in the previous lab, you have to modify it as per the function that you're trying to implement. And you have to just verify it in simulation and then try to synthesize it to generate some reports. So every time you run synthesis or simulation, some reports are generated, which you can see from the project manager on the left-hand side of the screen. So using that reports, you have to see that what are the timing parameters, what is your setup time or hold time for the whole design. So I hope during the class lectures, you have come across these terms. You should know what they are because every design has to meet certain timing constraints in order to work functionally correctly when it goes towards physical implementation. And then also there are some utilization reports. As the name suggests, utilization is about how many LUTs or how many basic elements of the FPGA you are using and how much memory you require, because memory is a big part of every design. So all that you will understand after you have implemented this design and seen the reports. Another important point here is that in this lab, you have to prepare a report. You have to mention all those parameters, whichever are asked in the document. And that also you have to submit along with your .v files and your .xzc file. So let's go over the document and see what the question is about. So you have to implement a 4x4 systolic array multiplier. So what is a systolic array and how does it do multiplication? So it is one of the most efficient architectures for implementing matrix multiplier, and most of the computations in your ML workloads or in other image processing workloads is matrix multiplication. So it's a huge bottleneck performance and area wise to most of the current designs. So for understanding what is a systolic array, I would recommend going through this lecture, A Beginner's Guide to Systolic Array 3x3 Multiplication using systolic arrays. I would also provide the link in the announcement. But here he explains you how a 3x3 multiplication works. Similarly, you have to implement it in a 4x4 fashion. The point is that as you can see, the PEs here are connected in certain fashion. Similarly, a PE description is given to you already in the template code. You have to instantiate or map the wires to the inputs and outputs of the PE such that it works in the systolic fashion. So it is important that you understand this video and you understand how systolic array does multiplication before proceeding to use the code and implement the matrix multiplication. So this is kind of a block diagram for the whole design. You have a matrix A and a matrix B, which are your input matrix, and you have to multiply them essentially. So they have to be stored somewhere. For storage, we are using some memory elements that are present on the FPGA, which are called block RAMs. So you all know that RAM is a kind of a memory, random access memory, and you all have it in your laptops. Similarly, FPGAs also have an efficient implementation of RAM, which is called block RAM. These are small size memories which are present on FPGA, which you can access and you can store the data and also retrieve the data whenever you want from them. How it is done is exactly written in the template code. We'll go over it briefly in a couple of minutes. And then also the output, which is a matrix C, has to be stored back into the block RAM. And the middle portion or the processor here is your systolic matrix multiplier. So you are given these files, matmul.v, matmul with ram.v, and a test bench. So you have to test also your design if it's working correctly. And now the first step is that you have to instantiate and connect the PEs. So as I was telling you, there are PEs which are connected in a mesh fashion. So you understand, you can see that in a 2D mesh, one PE would be connected to its 4 neighbors, each in north, south, east, and west direction. So those connections are through wires, and those wires are output from one PE or the preceding PE and an input to the next PE. So you have to carefully instantiate your PEs so that you can show the connection, that which two PEs are connected and in what fashion. So the main goal here is actually to see how many clock cycles does the whole 4 cross 4 multiplication takes. So this multiplier is working on a clock. And if you go through that video, the YouTube video, you'll see that systolic means in a heartbeat fashion. So just like the palpitations of your heart are called a systolic rhythm. So similarly, systolic array multiplier, your products or partial products are actually moving in a certain systolic fashion, and that is why the name of the architecture. So that essentially means that only after a certain number of clock cycles you can see the real output. And before that, all you see in the test bench or in the waveform are your partial products. So if you understand, you definitely understand how a shift and add multiplication works, and that is where you have to multiply two numbers. You take one bit from the second number and multiply the whole of the first number, and essentially you generate some partial products that way, the shifted versions, and then at the end you add bit by bit each of those bits to give you a product term which is definitely in larger bit width than your operands. So that is what is happening in systolic fashion in the array. So only after n clock cycles you will see the final result. So what is that n is something that you have to observe from the test bench and mention in your report. Now, another big task about this lab is to instantiate block RAMs. How would you instantiate them? How would you use them? It's again in the code. So you have to carefully go through each line of the code. And then you have to add some test cases maybe in the test bench. And you can try to observe that an answer of a matrix multiplication that you would like to see. So you can use a bunch of random numbers and create two matrix of 4 cross 4 dimension each, which will be your A and B matrix, and then you can see how your output is generated, which will again be a 4 cross 4 matrix. So for simulation, the instructions are here. So I would recommend going through each and every line of the document very carefully before you start. And then you have to do synthesis and implementation. So nothing will be run on the FPGA board, but doing synthesis and implementation tells you about how the design would look like in reality, because you get a bunch of reports which we have not seen before in any of the other labs. But observing those reports, you can tell how big the design would be. And when you physically lay out your cell, if you go for fabrication, then what are the other timing constraints and area constraints that you have to adhere to. So that is all explained here, what reports and how you have to see them. And there is a resource utilization report that you have to read and mention what numbers you are getting. And then these are your submission details. So another very important thing that I would like to mention is that all the labs have to be submitted by the 30th of this month. No submissions will be accepted after that, because all the grading has to be completed by them. And also in a couple of days, I will grade all the labs that have been submitted till now. So that is till LAB5. If you have any queries or if you have any confusion about grading, please write the email to me in this last week of the semester. And because after 1 or 2 of your next month, which is May, the grading would be finalized. So please reach out to me before that. And let's now briefly go over how the submission would look like. So you would have a report which will show you, in which you have to show how you have connected the PEs. So it's pretty much given here, but you need to understand every line in order to give your own numbers for the test cases and observe the output. Then how many clock cycles are there? You have to justify or verify these through your test bench. Then you have instantiated your block RAMs and added more test cases. So this is how you have to clearly mention in the report what all you have seen. You can also paste the waveforms. And then these are your timing reports. So in the document, if you read, they tell you that you have to use a 3 nanosecond period, but you will get some violations because you can understand that your design, how big or small it is, really decides on how fast or slow you can run it. So that is what you will try to experiment with here. So you'll increase the time period and you see that your violations are no more. And then your utilization report tells you all about the types of memories and amount of memories you're using, and also your DSP slices. So these are special computation units which are present on your FPGA board. And then you can see that if you have to reduce the utilization or increase the utilization, so there is something extra that is mentioned in the document that you can do to gain some extra credit. So this is how the report would look like. And the other documentations are the .v files. So these are the .v files. So you have defined all the parameters here in the beginning, and then you have used them in the matrix multiplication, instantiation, and other modules. So definitely you have to work with addresses because you are using block RAMs to store the data. So you have to retrieve them using some address because your memories are having certain addresses for particular location of data. So this code is already there on the canvas. You have to make changes to it and observe the output. So all this functionality is pretty straightforward. You just have to connect wires and see that what is feeding into which input is feeding to what output, and then how that output is further propagated towards another input. You have certain enable signals also. So enables are used when you want to deactivate certain part of your architecture, because in hardware everything is acting simultaneously, but before the input arrives to a certain section, you can clock enable it or just enable it or disable it in order to save power. So this code looks long because you have too many signals and wires, but essentially it's pretty standard how you work with systolic arrays, because every time the location of a particular output is fixed as per the inputs you provide to the design. And then this is your processing element, which is that one basic unit in your systolic array that you have used and maybe instantiated few times to generate the 4x4 multiplier. And then another code is this one where you have also used the memories. So the memory is block RAM here. So you can see the block RAM addresses and the data that you have read or written into. So there are start and clear control signals which indicate when is the output finally generated. And then your RAM is a dual port. So one would be a read port and one would be a write port. Then another file is really your test bench that you have to write yourself, and the XZC file. So after you have written the .v files, according to one of them, you can enable or disable your LEDs or switches in the XZC file and name them very carefully and try to generate the synthesis and implementation reports. So if you have any questions, I have office hours on Tuesday and Thursday. On Tuesday, it's from 11 to 12, and on Thursday, it's 10 to 11. So please attend those office hours, and also there would be one more recitation session next week. That would be last. So try to complete all the lab before that. If you have any trouble, please write an email to me and I'll try to help you in completing them as soon as possible. Thank you so much.